This is KPPQ LP Ventura, 104.1 FM, and we're in the Women's Room, where we appreciate and support each other. I'm your host, Kathleen Good. My guest today is Marsha De La O, our own Ventura Poet. She's the author of 2 collections of poetry, Black Hope and Antidote for Night. She and her husband, Phil Taggart, also a poet, published the poetry journal Askew. Hi, Marsha. We're so happy to have you here in the Women's Room.
Hi, Kathleen. I'm glad to be here.
Your husband, Phil, poet laureate of Ventura County, no less, told me that women changed everything in poetry, that by writing about emotions, they open poetry up. Is this true? And as a woman, how do you see women and poetry?
I think it is true that women changed everything. And I don't think it's quite true what he said about by writing about their emotions.
Oh, so how did they change everything?
Well, it's larger than the emotions. I think in the past, one of the realms that have been given to women is the idea of emotion. And therefore the men don't have to feel type of a thing.
Oh, okay.
So I think the way that women change things is that, well, if you think back to the 60s and Carolyn Kaiser writing, one of the things she said is, women are the custodians of the world's best-kept secrets.
Ooh.
Merely the private life of half of humanity. So it's this idea of unknown territory that women possess because for centuries, the whole idea of what constituted a human being was in essence masculine.
Oh.
And so women began opening that up, and some women were writing predominantly about emotion, some were writing about isolation, some were writing about politics. I think a lot about Adrienne Rich, who became a poet in the 50s in a very masculine environment when poetry itself was masculine. And it was very rigid, the way you were supposed to write poetry. How many syllables in a line, etc.
Oh, right. Sort of like the epic poem by John Milton.
A little updated from that because of the 50s. But,
okay.
You know,
right. But it had a very definite form.
Very formalist. Yeah. And so one of the things Adrienne Rich said about the way she approached poetry at that time when, as a college student and a graduate student, she was studying it, she thought of poetry as equivalent to asbestos gloves, like oven mitts. Uh-huh. Like you use that, oven mitts, for material that otherwise would be too hot to handle.
Wow.
Well, what happened is Adrienne Rich took off her gloves, and so did all the rest of the women, and this whole world that had not before been expressed was expressed.
And it was from a woman's intellect, not the feminine intellect, not the masculine intellect.
Yeah, it was. It was not received wisdom. It wasn't being told how to do it. It was intuitive. It was present. It was looking at your own experience as the way to know how to think and express.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Very interesting. Let me ask you another question. On the Poetry Foundation website, you're described as being associated with the landscapes and cityscapes of Southern California. Could you comment on why these are your topics?
I was born in Southern California, and my parents were born in Southern California, and my grandparents were born in Southern California. So I have a connection to the California landscape, and it happens that Antidote for Night, that most recent book, has landscape poems in there that express that.
Are you particularly taken by landscapes themselves? I mean, do you enjoy visually looking at them? Is that why you chose them?
Landscape, I think, is not really separate from human psyche. I think that where you grew up, where you live, and how you relate to the landscape you're in is inscribed in your psyche in a way that will inevitably come out in your work.
Very interesting. Marsha brought two of her poems to read today. The first, Under the Lemon Tree, about the death of her mother, and the second, The Immigrant Pauline, about her grandmother. I don't know if you can get more Ventura County than the lemon, so I'm guessing you wrote The Lemon Tree while you lived in Santa Paula.
That's a good guess, but not the case.
Oh, okay.
I worked for many years as a teacher in Santa Paula, and Santa Paula prides itself on being the citrus capital of the world, which I don't know if it still is. But if you think about lemons, they extend all the way into Ventura. So in my backyard in Ventura, I have a lemon tree.
Ah.
And my mother, when she first saw it, said to me, "Oh, this is going to cause you a lot of work. You're going to have to do things with lemons."
Oh, so that's why you associated your mother with lemons. Well, why don't you go ahead and read that poem for your listener?
Sure. Under the lemon tree. Not rain, but fine mist falls from my lemon tree, a balm of droplets in green shadow. 6 years now, my mother gone to earth. This dew, light as footsteps of the dead. She often walked out here, craned her neck, considered the fruit. Hundreds of globes in their leathery hides, figuring on custard and pudding, meringue and hollandaise. But her plans didn't work out. The tree goes on unceasingly. Lemons fall and fold into earth and begin again. Me, I come here as a salve against heat, come to languish, to let the soft burst, essence of citrus, summer's distillate, drift into my face and settle. Water and gold brew in the quiet deeps at the far end of the season. Leaves swallow the body of light, and the breath of water brims over. My hands cup each other the way hers did.
So you told us in this poem about the many sensory memories you have of your mother. Tell me, whenever you go out to your backyard, do you think of her?
Yes, I do. Of course I do.
And do you do some of the work with the lemons that she evoked for you?
Not really so much. I was thinking of having a different relationship with the tree. I never thought that I could process all those lemons. And so I wanted, I guess, an imaginative and poetic relationship with the tree. So I can write about the tree, but I could not use hundreds of lemons.
To make meringues and hollandaise and all the things you mentioned in the poem. That is a lovely sensory poem.
Thank you.
I also wanted to ask you, do you have a favorite line in the poem? Or maybe you like all of them.
Well, I have a favorite sentence.
Okay.
Well, maybe let me cut it down because it's kind of a long sentence, but so I'll cut it down after the comma splice. I come here as a salve against heat, come to languish, to let the soft bursts, essence of citrus, summer's distillate, drift into my face and settle.
I can just feel that as you read it. There's something about looking at into the radio that you've really evoked here with your poem about the lemon tree. So let's move on a little bit to the other poem that you have. And I was wondering, have you been inspired to write any poetry about the uncertainty of these times with an administration like no other?
Yes, as a matter of fact, I have been. I was surprised and distressed numerous times since the administration began. And so a lot of my poems that I've been writing in the last 5 months have had to do with topical themes that have come up.
So I was just wondering, now, do you take a current theme like immigration and then wait until an idea or a memory or a thought expresses that theme? For example, President Trump's attempts to get a travel ban for certain people. Did this inspire you then did you say, I think I'll write a poem on immigration, or you just happened to think of your grandmother?
I think the topic comes up. Immigration is a huge topic today, but also a huge topic in American history. And so as we confront how we feel and how we behave towards immigrants, it's natural to think about immigrants in the past, other times in American history when there were floods of immigrants and how they were received. And of course, I always think about the fact that virtually every American, except for the indigenous people who were already here, have an immigrant story.
Right, that's true. And this is, perhaps giving us a little bit of background about the poem. What is the story here in Immigrant Pauline?
Okay, first let me say that poems are, in essence, fictive. So that
fictive,
fictional,
fictional.
yes.
Okay.
So that there are things perhaps that I don't know about my immigrant grandmother, but that I needed to imagine in order for the poem to be fully detailed.
Oh, that's interesting.
So that's part of it.
Uh-huh.
And then, what was the rest of the question?
Just a little bit of background of
Okay.
where she, who Pauline is and where she came from.
Okay, so my grandmother, Pauline, was an immigrant. She arrived in 1902 at a time when immigrants absolutely were not being welcomed. There was a lot of nativist anger and fear towards immigrants.
Was it a time of unemployment?
I'm not really sure. I think just the flood of immigrants coming in from Europe was unsettling to people, and they felt at the time that it was changing the American character in ways that people didn't like.
And that's happened with every wave of immigration into our country. It's always the new, the strange that, upsets people. Okay, let's take a little break here. This is KPPQ LP Ventura, 104.1 FM, and we're in the Women's Room, where we appreciate and support each other. I'm your host, Kathleen Good. We've been talking to Marsha De La O, our very own Ventura poet, who is reading and discussing two of her original poems, Under the Lemon Tree, and a new poem, The Immigrant Pauline. And we're back. Perhaps now, Marsha, would be a good time to read your poem, The Immigrant Pauline.
I'd be glad to, Kathleen. The Immigrant Pauline. The years grow shorter now that less time separates me from the dead. My great-grandmother, laboring in a small town outside of Vienna, already seriously ill. So she knew when her baby daughter finally slid into light and the blood kept coming. What else would persuade a woman who'd just given birth to ride bleeding in a cart with a newborn and her 6-year-old back to her home village in Bohemia? Her husband was away in America, looking for the best place where she would never go. And into the arms of a 6-year-old, the dying woman passed her baby. And the little girl stepped over the threshold into the new strangeness of being an orphan, into plain care from a harsh woman who was her mother's mother. And there the little girl stayed, not yet called Pauline, that would come later at Ellis Island, stranded in a cottage with strangers, whitewashed walls, and over her cot a hand-tinted portrait of the emperor, for there was an emperor, and therefore an empire. Franz Joseph, staring into eternity, gold his cuffs and gold the hilt of his sword, red his double sash, and red gold the nest of mutton chops and beard. Did she love him a little for the floss of his hair, those blue eyes? Leopoldine gazed up, named for the King of Bohemia, young citizen of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, little Leopoldine, an orphan near the beginning of a century of war in an empire as rotten as a peach. She has a serious eye. After studying the portrait, she lays herself down to rest in her narrow bed and pulls the coverlet up to her chin. This is her siege. She will never take off her armor. She will learn to breathe and eat and sleep and work in a solution of desolation and determination. She can cross the ocean and become Pauline. She can speak a fierce English laid over gutturals. She can make a strudel. By the time the ashes of empire flare into flame again and again, she has unspooled a thread of blood so long that her daughters' daughters, far away and safe, don't know what any of it means. The red river running down Titova Street in Sarajevo next to the blue, the red chairs in rows as far as heaven, and among the legions of seats for the souls of the lost, hundreds of little ones for slain children. She didn't tell me anything. She held her silence. She taught me next to nothing.
So what do you mean by she taught you nothing? She never told you anything about her experience?
Yes, she did not really talk very much about her experience, not her experience of being a small child in Bohemia and in Austria, and not her experience of being an immigrant here. That's what I mean by next to nothing. But also, I said she taught me next to nothing, not nothing.
Oh, okay.
So next to nothing, in my mind, could also mean what it means to stand next to nothing, to have your whole life overturned, to not know where you're going, to not know what it will be like there. Immigrants have to stand next to nothing when they come. They don't know. And then when they're here, it's not easy and has never been easy.
Not easy to assimilate.
Exactly.
What I was dying to know as you finished the poem was, did her father, who was in America searching for a place to live, come back to get her and her baby sister?
Yes, he did.
Oh.
Yes, he did. I don't know exactly when he came back. She was 14 when she came through Ellis Island.
So, and she was about 6 in the poem. And, so she lived with her grandmother all those many years. So where did she immigrate to?
They came through Ellis Island, so they were on the East Coast. They lived in Massachusetts, and she, unlike most of the women at that time, she had to work. She had a profession. She was determined. She became a nurse. She worked at Boston General Hospital, And her sister, her younger sister, had married and had children and was living on a farm in Riverside. And when her younger sister needed help with her children and the farm, that's when she came out to California.
Well, that's quite a history. So you used imagery of the Emperor Franz Joseph. Did you actually, have a picture of him in mind? Did she tell you about looking at this picture, or you just used that as a way to bring on the theme of empire?
I used it to bring on the theme of empire. She was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and it really was rotten. And Franz Joseph had many, portraits, beautiful portraits done with this sort of red gold theme. And so I used that to suggest the way people looked at emperors.
Oh. Well, how did they look at emperors?
Well, she was named Leopoldine for the king of Bohemia in 1300 and something, and he was also the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire at that time, which people say was not holy, was not Roman, and was not an empire.
Oh.
So just to suggest that people of the lower classes idolized these figures.
They saw them as gods, really.
Yes.
And did she continue through her life to admire authority figures, or perhaps you don't know that?
I don't really know that, but what I do know is that she became American. She was determined to speak English. She was determined to fit into where she was. She was not Catholic. She became a Protestant. She fit into the community where she was.
Oh, wow. As many immigrants today work very hard to fit into their communities. What did you want her to teach you?
I think I would have liked to have known more about everything about her life. And she was not forthcoming that way. She didn't talk about herself very much.
Oh, right. Much like I've been interviewing people who had service during World War II, and many of them have said the same thing. I've never talked about this before. Why do you think people of that generation don't want to talk about themselves?
I'm just going to guess that that in the past there was more of the stiff upper lip and the zipped lip, and that our generation and the generations after have delved into psyche in ways that maybe previous generations didn't even feel it was safe to do.
Oh, perhaps. You describe with these words the thread of blood so long, and it evoked in me the idea of a direct line of descent of the girl child from the mother, which is probably much closer than with a boy child, perhaps because a boy has to leave the mother to become a man. Is this what you meant, or perhaps you could just talk about those words?
That's not directly what I was addressing. The thread of blood unspooling so long refers to the fact that I'm her granddaughter and my mother was her daughter. So yes, that does refer to 3 generations of women. But really, what it was directly addressing is how soon we forget history and how little we know and gather from it. So most of us don't really understand the causes of World War I, and yet the permutations are still sifting through the modern world, in the former Yugoslavia, in Bosnia, and Albania, and Macedonia.
So that, the poem spans, a century of war, between World War I, was it, or is it earlier than that? And past World War II.
Well, when you think about immigrants from that area of the world, from Bohemia, Czechoslovakia, Austria, if they came over at the beginning of the century, what tremendous good luck. What tremendous good luck. They missed World War I right where it started. There were 17 million civilians died.
Right.
So they were so lucky to be here in spite of every hardship that they faced.
Well, and did your grandmother feel that way?
I'm sure she did. I'm sure she did. I mean, she worked very hard. She came out to help her sister. She was by that time in the second half of her 30s, so she was a spinster nurse, a single woman.
Mm-hmm.
And an older man whose wife had died, a well-to-do farmer, former farmer, he became ill and advertised for a nurse. And she answered the ad and took care of him during his illness.
Uh-huh.
And this was the man she married.
Oh, wow. This poem actually evoked me to look at sort of a family narrative. It isn't quite a family tree that my aunt sent me shortly before she died. And I kind of skimmed it over, but after reading your poem, I read it much more carefully and found out that, in fact, my grandmother's father had been on the Supreme Court in Switzerland, and my grandfather's father had been a horse trader who went from Switzerland or Germany to Russia and later died there. So your poem has really evoked the stories of the immigrants, the millions and millions of stories. And it seems like if each of these stories could be heard, we would be more able to perhaps pass good legislation that would solve some of the immigrant problems going on now.
I feel like that's really true. I feel like there's a wealth of knowledge in history and thinking about our ancestors and looking at what has happened in the past and then balancing it against the ideals that we hope to represent in our country.
Well, thank you for reading these poems. I was really overcome with emotion when you read the poem about your grandmother Pauline. I really want to thank you for bringing these powerful poems to the Women's Room. We only have a minute or two left here. I was just wondering if you could tell us anything about your love of poetry.
Thank you. I guess I could say that I love poetry because it's both large and small. A small form that you have a chance to finish in a way that perhaps a writer doesn't with a novel, and a large form in that it can hold literally everything.
Thank you very much. And I understand you had a final quote to leave us from another woman poet.
Poet and science fiction writer Ursula Le Guin said about women, "We are volcanoes. When we women offer our experience as our truth, as human truth, all the maps change. There are new mountains."
Wow, thank you very much for coming to the Women's Room, Marsha. I'd love to have you again with another poem.
I'd be glad to come back. Thank you, Kathleen.
This is KPPQ LP Ventura, 104.1 FM, and we're in the Women's Room, where we appreciate and support each other. I'm your host, Kathleen Good. We've been talking to Marsha De La O, our very own Ventura poet, who read and discussed two of her original poems, Under the Lemon Tree and the new poem, The Immigrant Pauline. Her poetry books, Black Hope and Antidote for Night, are available from your local library.